Hey guys, welcome to our final content day discussing how Jesus interacted with the everyday Jewish life. We saw him on the Sabbath, loving a lame man at the pool of Bethesda, while the religious leaders got angry at Jesus. Jesus continues teaching the people, giving them the example of the Passover bread. He is the new special bread that marks a new and special relationship with God. And yesterday, on day 3 content, we saw that Jesus points to the truth that his presence on earth is temporary, just like the huts were in the Feast of Booths, and that he will return one day to establish a physical kingdom that will last forever. Today we've come to our 4th and final feast that Jesus is going to interact with. After the Sabbath, the Passover, and the Feast of Booths, Jesus will appear at the Feast of Dedication. Now today, this feast is more commonly known as Hanukkah. This feast will show up in John chapter 10 and will take place sometime in November of December of Jesus' first ministry year. Now perhaps you have heard of Hanukkah. Remember, I think this past year, walking around at Christmas time and seeing the Hanukkah symbol in stores. Although it is a joyful celebration, it actually points to the most difficult moment in all of Jewish history. By connecting this story to the timeline of Jesus, John is going to remind his readers that Jesus will bring God's salvation at a very high cost. The story that leads to the Feast of Hanukkah happened in the time period that is represented in your Bible by the thin page between the Old and the New Testaments. In Bible class, we've called this the intertestamental period. In this time in history, Alexander the Great had conquered many of the nations around Greece, nations that included Israel. The Greek language and culture spread, and many of the Jews began joining in what was called the Hellenization of the Middle East. No need to remember that term. But when another emperor came after Alexander the Great, this new emperor tried to force Greek culture on the people that he ruled. For the Jews, that meant that they were not allowed to celebrate their feasts, that their holy books were burned in public, and that they could not meet anymore. The evil Greek soldiers actually burned a pig on the temple's altar, disrespecting God. But one day, a man named Mattathias began a revolt. There were bloody battles, but eventually they kicked the Greeks out of the land of Israel and eventually out of the city of Jerusalem. And the amazing thing is that they first went to the temple, they cleaned it up, and they prayed to God. And they celebrated the Feast of Booths a couple months late, and did so with great joy. And at the end of the feast, they commanded that all people would celebrate the recapturing of the temple by Matthias. And since then, the Jews have done just that. And even to this day, they have a big party with candles and food and everything to remind themselves of the joyful light that came at the end of this terribly dark Greek occupation. In short, it could be compared to our Independence Day in America. So we know the context now. So let's have a look at John chapter 10. During this 4th feast in the book of John, the religious leaders corner Jesus. Now, not with swords of the temple guards, but with words this time. In chapter 10, verse 24, we see what they are after. They say, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, the Messiah, tell us plainly." Jesus responds in verse 25 by saying, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you do not believe because you are not among my sheep." Now I imagine that they are still filled with confusion. And so Jesus, continuing our passage, summarizes the truth in verse 30 by saying, "I and the Father are one." Jesus is God, God is Jesus, the truth that in class we talked about as the Trinity. Now the Jews are so filled with anger in this moment that they actually pick up stones to kill Jesus. They hate Jesus, they hate his message. It's the 4th time in this week's content that the religious leaders have responded in a similar way. Why is that? Why can't they just leave Jesus alone, or better yet, believe in him? Because they see Jesus as someone who is disrespecting their God, but their reality couldn't be further than their thoughts. God himself was Jesus. I love that John has placed the story in the Feast of Hanukkah. remembering these godly warriors that loved God so much, they risked everything to restore the temple. And Jesus was going to give up everything to allow all people to worship God rightly. But just like it took Mattathias a battle to restore the temple, so Jesus' message was going to come at a cost. This week we've seen Jesus interact with the everyday rhythms of Jewish lives. From the weekly Sabbath to the feasts that happen in the spring, in the fall, and in the winter, Jesus is right there. He's among the people. Remember the summary statement that John started off his gospel with? In John chapter 4, he writes those famous words, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Jesus came to be with us so that one day we could be with him and celebrate the feast of heaven with him for an eternity.